I was 22, a fact that felt more like a temporary condition than an identity, a cheap coat I was forced to wear for a few seasons. Ellie was 38, an age that seemed to her a permanent indictment, a verdict handed down by a jury of her past selves. The very first words she ever spoke to me, uttered from the shadowy threshold of her kitchen as I stood on her porch wrestling with a faulty fuse box that had plagued her for a week, were, "Kid, you're too young for anything with me." She didn't say it unkindly, not at all. It wasn't a dismissal so much as a sad, foregone conclusion, delivered with the weary resignation of someone who had already read the last page of a book about spectacularly bad decisions and had no interest in an unauthorized sequel. She had this way of speaking in absolutes, as if she were the universe's disgruntled stenographer, tasked with holding everyone to its most established and unforgiving rules. It was a warning, clear and simple, a boundary drawn in the dusty, neglected soil between our two duplex properties. But lines in the dust are notoriously susceptible to the wind, to a sudden downpour, to the simple act of a foot crossing over. 6 months later, in that same kitchen, the air thick with the unspoken history of 100 small, shared moments, of borrowed sugar and returned tools, of knowing glances across the lawn, she pushed a chipped ceramic mug across the worn oak table, its substantial warmth seeping into my hands. Her own hands were wrapped around a matching, flawless cup, a stark contrast that felt deeply intentional. She stared into the steam rising from her tea, a miniature fog that obscured the world, avoiding my eyes, and muttered, "Don't leave yet. Stay." It wasn't a question that left room for a negative answer. It wasn't a demand backed by any authority. It was a plea, soft and fractured and utterly raw, and with those 2 words, every rule we had so carefully memorized, every safe distance we had painstakingly maintained, rewound itself at an impossible speed. The entire, fragile architecture of our neighborly arrangement, a structure built of convenience and polite avoidance, collapsed into a silence that was heavier, deeper, and more terrifyingly hopeful than anything I had ever known. It all began with a light. Her porch light, a cheap, glass-encased fixture that was probably original to the duplex, had developed a nervous tick, a frantic, incessant blinking that disturbed the profound quiet of our dead-end cul-de-sac. It had been flickering for 3 nights straight, a manic little SOS tapped out in Morse code into the indifferent suburban night, and it was driving me mad. I was working the graveyard shift at a massive, soulless logistics depot back then, a world of humming conveyor belts and the relentless beeping of forklifts. My sleep schedule was a fragile, ruined thing, and that blinking was a personal affront to my REM cycle, a tiny, luminous bully keeping me awake. So, one sweltering afternoon, fueled by sleep deprivation and a sense of neighborly duty, I killed the main breaker to her house, plunging her side of the world into an artificial daytime twilight. I hauled over the heavy wooden ladder my dad used to swear at every Sunday with a kind of religious fervor. It was his legacy, that ladder, along with a deep, abiding distrust of faulty wiring and cheap contractors. Ellie, who was still Mrs. Harper to the mailman and the few other neighbors we barely acknowledged, emerged from her house just as I was perched precariously on the last rung, poking at the fixture's innards. She stood on the stoop, arms folded tightly across a sweater the faded blue color of old, well-loved jeans, a shield against the world. It was a defensive posture, the kind that expected a bill, an invoice, a complication, another problem to solve. I found the loose wire in minutes, a simple fix, secured it with a neat twist of black electrical tape, and flipped the fixture's little switch. A steady, warm, unwavering light bloomed against the tired siding. I climbed down, my hands grimy, and she just watched me, her expression utterly unreadable, her dark eyes giving nothing away. She raised a single, skeptical eyebrow. "Thanks, neighbor," she said, her voice a little rough around the edges, as if she wasn't used to using it for casual pleasantries. Then, without another word, no handshake, no polite smile, not even a nod of gratitude, she disappeared back inside her house. The screen door swung shut with a soft, final sigh, and through the fine mesh drifted the sudden, sharp, and inexplicably lonely smell of oranges being peeled. It was the smell of a life being lived entirely on the other side of a wall, a world I could sense but never enter. After that initial, silent transaction, our relationship settled into a rhythm of quiet, reciprocal exchanges, a language spoken in favors and gestures, not words. It was transactional, and therefore, it was safe for both of us. I became the resident handyman, the one who dealt with the physical world's minor annoyances, the squeaks and leaks of a shared property. Every Tuesday evening, before I left for my shift, I'd tug her heavy rubbish and recycling bins to the curb alongside my own. On those mornings, I'd often find a thermos of surprisingly good, dark coffee left on the windshield of my beat-up sedan, still radiating a gentle warmth. A silent thank you. If her porch light so much as flickered again, I would appear with my toolbox before she even had to text. When she bought a new bookshelf and stood defeated before the flat-packed box of cryptic instructions and 1,000 tiny screws, one soft, hesitant knock on the shared wall of our duplex was the only summons I needed. I'd cross the small, scorched patch of brown grass that separated our territories and assemble it for her in her living room, our conversation strictly limited to the task at hand, pass the screwdriver, is this right side up, and, I think that's an Allen key. Nothing dramatic ever happened. Nothing personal was ever revealed. These were just neighborly duties, small acts of service that kept the machinery of our adjacent lives running smoothly. It was a framework built on unspoken agreements and comfortable, unbreachable distances, a carefully constructed fortress of safe stuff, designed with meticulous precision to keep the chaotic complexities of real human connection securely locked outside. We were the architects of a sterile and meticulously maintained peace, and for a while, that was more than enough for both of us. Then came the storm. It wasn't just rain, it was a violent, theatrical tantrum of a thunderstorm that rolled in from the west with the speed and fury of an invading army. It knocked the entire block into a sudden, primitive darkness, stealing the power and plunging us back a century. The world beyond my window vanished completely into a roaring, percussive abyss of wind and water. A flicker of primal concern, an ancient instinct I hadn't known I possessed, made me grab a heavy-duty flashlight from my junk drawer and cross the churning yard. I found her on her back steps, huddled under the flimsy protection of a small, rusting tin awning. The torrential rain was already curling the loose ends of her dark hair, plastering them to her neck and cheeks. In her hand, she held a small, sputtering candle stub, its tiny flame fighting a desperate, losing battle against the wind as she repeatedly flicked a cheap plastic lighter, trying to coax it back to life. She didn't seem startled to see me emerge from the deluge. It was as if she had been expecting someone, or perhaps just anyone, to materialize out of the blackness. I sat down on the wet concrete step beside her without asking, the silence between us more profound and more communicative than the percussive chaos of the storm itself. We listened to the tin awning above us bang and shudder like a frantic, offbeat drum. We watched the lightning bleach the world white for a split second, revealing the thrashing, tormented trees and a world utterly unmoored from its foundations. After a long time, her voice, when it came, was quiet, almost carried away by the wind, a near whisper against the gale. "I always thought I hated silence," she said, still staring out into the roaring dark, her profile illuminated in another flash of lightning. "But I was wrong. I was so wrong. It turns out I only hate the kind of silence that comes from nobody else being here." She never once looked at me as she confessed this. As she spoke, I found myself tracing the pattern of freckles scattered across the back of her neck with my eyes. They were like tiny, uncharted constellations in the brief, ghostly light of the storm, a secret map I wasn't meant to see. In that moment, the air grew thick and heavy, pressing in on me with the undeniable weight of her admission, the crushing weight of a loneliness so vast it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the world. The morning brought with it a weak, watery sunlight and the familiar, reassuring hum of restored power. The coffee maker in my kitchen gurgled back to life, a sound that felt both beautifully mundane and utterly miraculous. But something vital between us had been unplugged by the storm, and it hadn't been fixed by the utility company. The fragile, carefully maintained equilibrium was gone forever. Later that day, I collected her mail along with my own out of habit. Sorting through the damp envelopes, I saw the usual collection of bills and junk mail, almost all of it addressed to a Mr. and Mrs. Harper. The name felt like a phantom limb. I walked over and, finding her screen door unlocked as it often was, stepped inside her kitchen to place the stack on her counter. It felt like a significant transgression, crossing that threshold in the bright, unforgiving light of day without a specific, transactional purpose. She was there, wiping down the counters with methodical, circular motions. She simply glanced at the letters before stacking them into a neat, unread pile, her face betraying nothing. She offered no comment, no explanation for the name on the envelopes. Her movements were precise, efficient, and imbued with a deep, resonating sadness. My eyes fell to her left hand. The ring finger was bare, but a pale, shallow dent in the skin remained, the ghost of the gold band that had once lived there. It was a mark of profound absence, a story told in negative space, more powerful than any scar. I started noticing everything then. I noticed the way she always made just enough coffee for one, the lonely ritual of it. I noticed the way the books on her shelf were all worn paperbacks, love stories and thrillers with cracked spines, with no heavy hardcovers, none of the dense non-fiction Mr. Harper might have read. I noticed the silence in her house wasn't just quiet, it was empty, a hollowed-out space that noise could never truly fill. A week later, she asked for my help tightening a loose hinge on an upper kitchen cabinet. It was a simple, familiar job, one I'd done a dozen times before in my own place. Her kitchen was warm, insulated from the world, filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and something else, something that was just her, a faint, clean scent of soap and tea leaves. I was leaning into the cabinet, the cool wood pressing against my cheek, screwdriver in hand, when my grip slipped on the worn plastic handle. The metal tip skittered across the painted wood and sliced a clean, deep gash across my right knuckle. It wasn't a terrible cut, but it bled with a surprising, almost comical enthusiasm, a single, perfect drop of red blooming on my skin before running down my finger. Before I could even react, before I could instinctively reach for a paper towel, Ellie was there. She moved with a sudden, startling urgency that erased the space between us, grabbing a clean, folded dish towel from the counter. "Oh, you idiot," she breathed, the word somehow more tender than insulting, a soft rebuke meant for the universe itself. She took my hand in both of hers, her fingers surprisingly warm and steady, and pressed the folded cotton firmly against the cut. And then she held it. She just held my hand, for a beat too long, then another, and the world seemed to slow down and stretch out, becoming thick like honey. I could feel the frantic, unsteady rhythm of her pulse through the thin fabric, a frantic bird trapped in her wrist, beating against my own. I could smell the faint scent of soap on her skin, the lingering ghost of cinnamon in the air. I looked up at her, and her eyes, dark and wide, were fixed on our joined hands. Her lips were slightly parted. The air between us crackled with a sudden, dangerous electricity. "You're too young," she whispered, the words a fragile, broken mantra, a desperate prayer. It was clear she was reminding herself far more than she was reminding me. And she stopped, cutting the sentence off, leaving the confession to hang in the air between us, steaming and unresolved, just like the forgotten kettle that had begun to whistle its shrill, insistent song on the stove. She let go of my hand as if it had suddenly become red-hot, and turned away abruptly to deal with the screaming kettle, leaving me with a throbbing knuckle and a silence more charged and deafening than any sound. That night, sleep was an impossibility, a foreign country I couldn't enter. I sat in the oppressive dark of my bedroom, the blue-white glow of my phone screen illuminating nothing, casting long, distorted shadows on the wall. I wasn't scrolling, I was replaying the pause. That single, infinite, suspended moment in her kitchen when time had stretched and warped around us like taffy. Was it profound regret I had seen in her eyes, or was it a desperate, white-knuckled restraint? Was she pulling herself back from a cliff's edge she hadn't seen coming, or was she silently mourning a leap she knew she couldn't bring herself to take? I couldn't tell. The ambiguity of it was maddening, a puzzle with a missing piece that I kept turning over and over in my mind. At the first hint of dawn, when the sky was a bruised, melancholic purple, a sound drifted through my open window. It was her, humming. It was a simple, nameless, meandering tune, and it was painfully, beautifully off-key. The sound pulled me from my room as if on an invisible string. I stepped outside, my bare feet cold and sensitive against the dew-wet concrete of my own porch. She was across the yard, sitting on her old wooden porch swing, moving it back and forth with one foot in a slow, hypnotic, rhythmic glide. She saw me, and her humming faltered for just a second before resuming, a little softer this time, more self-conscious. She shifted over on the wide wooden seat of the swing, a clear, unspoken invitation that hung in the cool morning air. There was room for me. But I didn't sit. I couldn't. I just stood there, my hands shoved deep into the pocket of my hoodie, feeling the immense, crushing weight of every one of the 16 years that separated us. And beneath that, buried deeper, I felt the smaller, tighter, and far more terrifying weight of every almost touch, every shared silence, every unspoken question we had collected like stones in our pockets. Autumn arrived and began its slow, deliberate, beautiful work of stripping the world bare. The massive maple tree in her front yard became a bonfire, its leaves turning a brilliant, defiant, impossible red before surrendering to the ground in rustling waves. They carpeted her lawn in a thick layer of fire, a beautiful, dying thing that we both wordlessly, instinctively agreed not to step into, walking around its edges as if it were sacred ground. One crisp October evening, she invited me for tea. Not coffee from a thermos left on my car, but tea, inside her house, an official invitation that felt like a diplomatic summit. Her kitchen, my new favorite room in the world, smelled of cinnamon, old wood, and brewing Earl Grey. It was a scent of domestic peace and settled history that felt entirely at odds with the silent, undeclared war being waged between us. On the table, 2 mugs waited like chess pieces. One was a perfect, pristine white ceramic, smooth and unblemished. The other was the one I'd seen before, the one with a hairline crack running like a river from the rim and a small, dark chip near the base. She slid the cracked one my way across the table, a deliberate, meaningful gesture. "It's stronger," she said, a faint, cryptic smile playing on her lips that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Holds the heat better." We talked for what felt like hours, but it was a conversation built of nothing, a masterpiece of evasion. We talked about the rising price of groceries, the annoying habits of the neighbor's yapping dog, the undeniable chill in the air that signaled the coming of winter. Each topic was a carefully chosen buffer, a safe, neutral territory we could occupy to avoid looking at the vast, uncharted, and dangerous wilderness that lay between us. The conversation eventually slowed, then sputtered, then died, like a record reaching its final, silent groove. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't uncomfortable or awkward, it was expectant, heavy with unspoken things, full of potential energy. Ellie set her perfect mug down on the table with a soft, decisive click that echoed in the quiet room. She stared at it for a long moment, as if it held all the answers, then finally lifted her head, her gaze direct and unflinching. "I keep waiting," she began, her voice low and steady, each word carefully chosen. "I keep waiting for you to do something young and reckless and stupid. And I keep waiting for myself to have the good sense to stop you before you do." She paused, tracing the smooth rim of her cup with a fingertip, a small, nervous gesture. "Maybe we're both just tired of waiting." My own heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic prisoner desperate for escape. I drained the last of my tea, the warm liquid a stark contrast to the ice that had formed in my veins. The chipped rim of the mug scraped against my lip, a tiny, grounding pain that pulled me back to the moment. I set it down and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time without the shield of our carefully constructed roles as neighbor and handyman. "I'm here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, cutting through the thick silence. "Tell me what you want." It was a direct challenge, a demand for an end to the ambiguity, a request for a clear sign. Her gaze darted away from mine, a frightened bird seeking shelter. She looked at the table, at the steam still rising from our mugs, at the dark window reflecting the cozy kitchen light, anywhere but at me. It felt like an eternity past, a lifetime lived in the space between heartbeats. Then, slowly, as if it took every ounce of her strength, she brought her eyes back to mine. They were dark, deep, and filled with a terrifying, breathtaking mix of fear and surrender. "Stay tonight," she said, the words barely a whisper, almost lost in the quiet of the room. She took a shaky breath, the sound of a dam breaking. "Just stay." The couch was an antique, probably beautiful once, with carved wooden legs and faded velvet upholstery, but now it was just short. My legs, dangling awkwardly off the end, felt like foreign objects I was responsible for but couldn't control. Sleep was a distant country I had no visa for, my mind was a loud, chaotic airport. I lay there in the dark, listening. The house groaned and settled around me, speaking in a secret language of old wood and shifting foundations. Every creak of the floorboards upstairs was her footstep, every sigh of the wind against the windowpane was her voice whispering my name. At what must have been around 3 a.m., a thin sliver of light appeared as the living room door opened with an almost imperceptible click. She stood in the doorway, a silhouette wrapped in a thick wool blanket, a ghost haunting her own home, looking small and uncertain. She didn't speak. She just walked over and sat on the floor beside the couch, her back against its worn velvet, her head resting near my knee, close enough for me to feel the warmth radiating from her. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, the only movement the slow, steady rise and fall of our chests. We breathed. There was no kissing, no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations of love or intent. There was only the shared, rhythmic act of inhale and exhale, a secret passed back and forth in the deep, silent dark, a communication more profound and intimate than any words could ever be. It was a silent acknowledgement that we were both there, together, in the same wreckage, breathing the same air, and that for now, that was enough. It was everything. In the morning, the fragile spell was broken by the harsh, unfiltered reality of daylight streaming through the windows. She made eggs. Her movements were quiet, precise, and imbued with a new, tender awkwardness. She didn't hum. The silence in the kitchen wasn't empty anymore, it was full, saturated with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't. After we ate in near silence, the clinking of our forks against the plates the only sound, I stood up, the unspoken rules of the morning dictating that it was time for me to leave, to retreat to my side of the wall and let the day reset. I walked to the door, my hand on the cool brass of the knob. "Cal," she said. It was the first time she had ever used my name. She tasted it in the daylight, testing its shape, its weight on her tongue. I paused, my back still to her, my heart giving a painful lurch. I turned back to look at her. She was leaning against the counter, a dish towel twisted in her hand, and a small, rueful smile touched her lips. It was a smile that held a universe of complication within it, a whole novel of worry and hope. "Still too young, technically," she said, her voice soft but clear. The old warning, the one she'd used as a shield for months, but the venom was gone completely. It was just an observation now, a fact of the world like the sun in the sky or the chipped mug on her counter. I felt a genuine, unforced smile spread across my own face. I shrugged, a gesture that felt impossibly light, as if a great weight had been lifted. "And you're still technically asking me to stay?" She let out a short, breathy laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief that seemed to brighten the entire room. She looked down at the floor, shaking her head. "Guess the rules are negotiable. We didn't make headlines. We didn't rewrite the stars or defy gravity. We just made a routine. A new one, woven carefully from the threads of the old one, familiar but different. The transactional nature of our past gave way to a quiet, collaborative present. Sunday mornings became a ritual. I would stand in her kitchen, my hands clumsy and inevitably covered in flour, attempting to knead bread dough while she leaned against the counter, sipping her coffee and telling me, with a mock-serious tone, every single thing I was doing wrong. "More pressure, Cal. You're petting it, not kneading it." On Tuesday nights, before my shift, we'd sit at her kitchen table while the kettle hissed its slow, melodic climb to a boil, and she would quiz me with my own anatomy flashcards for a physiology class I was taking at the community college, trying to build a life beyond the logistics depot. "The radius and ulna are in the," she'd ask, brow furrowed in genuine concentration. "The forearm." I'd answer, and she'd give a small, proud smile as if she were the one who'd gotten it right. "The porch light," the nervous, flickering catalyst for everything, got swapped out for a warmer, softer bulb, one that didn't buzz or flicker but cast a steady, welcoming, golden glow. Our lives began to bleed into one another's in small, almost imperceptible ways. Her thrillers started appearing on my nightstand, my boring textbooks found their way onto her coffee table. Sometimes, her hand would brush against mine as we both reached for the same serving bowl at dinner. And sometimes, now, we let it. We let the contact linger for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, a silent, shared acknowledgement of the new, fragile, and beautiful territory we were exploring together, one hesitant touch at a time. One frigid December evening, the first real snow of the season was falling, thick, silent flakes that muffled the world and made everything feel clean and new. She found me on my own front steps, just sitting there, watching the snow accumulate on my shoulders like a heavy white mantle. The cold was seeping into my bones, a deep, invasive chill, but I hadn't felt like going inside to my empty half of the duplex. She opened her front door, and the warm, golden light from her house spilled out onto the snow-covered yard, a beacon in the twilight. She held out the chipped mug, the one she always gave me, steam rising from it in a thick, inviting plume that curled in the cold air. "You left this inside," she said. It was a lie, I hadn't been over all day. It was an excuse. An invitation. I took the mug, my cold fingers wrapping around its familiar warmth, the ceramic a conduit for hers. The steam fogged my glasses, momentarily blinding me. She pushed a stray strand of dark hair, damp with melting snow, behind her ear, a small, nervous gesture I had come to adore, a sign that she was still figuring this out, too. "You're not 22 forever, you know," she said, looking out at the falling snow, at the world being gently erased and remade. I laughed, my breath clouding in the freezing air. "And you're not 38 forever, either." She rolled her eyes, but the smile that accompanied it was genuine and bright, reaching all the way to her eyes. "Point is," she continued, her voice softer, more serious, "we've got time. We've got time to figure out what this is." I sipped the hot cocoa. It was rich and sweet, but with a faint, underlying bitterness from the dark chocolate she always used. Like us, I thought. Complicated and messy and real. Exactly like us. And that's how it started. That's how it continued. It wasn't a whirlwind romance or a dramatic, passionate affair you see in movies. It was a story that began with a busted fuse, a flickering porch light that refused to be ignored, the lonely smell of oranges through a screen door, and a warning that we both, in our own time and in our own way, chose to disregard. It was a quiet revolution built on the foundation of 1,000 small, seemingly insignificant moments, a shared silence during a thunderstorm that said more than 1,000 words, the ghost of a ring on a finger, the startling, unexpected warmth of a hand holding yours over a dish towel, and the quiet, earth-shattering courage it takes to look at someone you shouldn't want and simply ask them to stay. If anyone out there has ever looked past the birthday printed on your license, past the labels and the expectations, and seen the person you are still in the process of becoming, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a story in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button if you enjoy tales that refuse to color inside the neat, pre-drawn lines society hands us, stories that live in the messy, beautiful gray areas. And if you happen to be out on your own porch right now, lingering a little longer than you need to, finding excuses to stay in the orbit of a neighbor you can't quite figure out, well, maybe flip on your light. Shine it out into the dark. You never know who might be waiting on the other side of the yard, watching that light, looking for an invitation, hoping for a reason to stay.